a conclusion that an American student of mythology, a man called Joseph Campbell, came to about stories that he analyzed from around the world, myths, legends, fairy tales, folk tales. He called his book The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and it was based on literally the analysis of thousands upon thousands of stories. And he found that over the history of humanity, a single story with familiar types of characters, symbols, and relationships emerged over and over again. And he called this story, he called this hero quest, the monomyth, the basis of all story. So writers call it the hero's journey. And its rather grand title springs from the fact that among the stories that he analyzed were the grandest stories of all, the stories of Troy and Greece, the Odyssey and the Iliad, and so on. Those are stories full of tragedy and comedy and sudden turns of fortune. They concern daring quests and dangerous adventures that bring their characters to the very edge of life and death and beyond. Even if you've never read them, you've absorbed echoes of them through countless books and plays and films. So Mish.
Yeah, I'd like to just echo what Richard has said. While this journey is based on these very ancient and universal ideas, it's gained a lot of currency with contemporary writers, screenwriters, novelists, and playwrights, because it has this very fluid and creative structure that makes it easy to adapt, easy to update and innovate for people who are watching films and reading books today. They're stories of heroism, but don't get confused between the idea of a hero as being someone who has to be as big and mighty a character as Ulysses. It can be a very small story, in fact, a quiet heroism about ordinary day people, as much as it can be about these stirring quests about kings and warriors, but it always concerns big questions of life. So that could be conflict, it could be hate, it could be fear, it could be death, or it could be laughter, but things that as humans we're very attracted to, stories that have a lot of power and hold us in thrall. So even if it's a small story, it has this quality of heroism. And why is that? Why is it that the hero's journey is just such a compelling narrative for writers today? And I think it's because these stories serve as maps for our own journeys through life. So we share in the lives of these characters who battle the odds and win or lose, and in a way that's some sort of process for us to understand ourselves and the world, and to prepare ourselves for our own individual hero stories. And I can hear the women out there in the webinar thinking, well, what about the heroine's journey? Why is it called the hero's journey? Well, the hero's journey is certainly not the province of men. It's also the heroine's journey. It's a psycho-spiritual journey to wholeness, which applies to everyone regardless of your gender, your race, your religion. It's a universal prototype. I mean, if we think of the most famous modern heroines' journey in movies, for example, we'd think of Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. And if we think of a heroine in classic literature, we'd think of Jane Eyre, who embarks on the heroine's journey. There's The Silence of the Lambs, there's Missouri and Carol. These are just some of the films that follow that journey. And I'm sure you've all been watching TV series like The Handmaid's Tale and The Queen's Gambit, which very, very closely follow the journey of the heroine.
So the hero's journey is divided, really for convenience sake, into 12 steps. And I'm going to run through those very briefly. In fact, shall I put this up on the screen? while I talk about them. There we go. So Act 1 of the story starts in the ordinary world, where we see the hero at the start of the journey before his adventure begins. Then he is called to adventure. Something or someone or some incident calls him to go on the adventure. It might be a problem or challenge. It might be a letter from Hogwarts. It might be the lure of the sea. Now the hero, because he's comfortable in his ordinary world, says no. Characteristically, he refuses to begin with. He refuses the adventure, the call to adventure. And it's only when, and that's because he's naturally fearful of the world of the adventure and of the ogres and the beasts and the dragons that might live there. And his own inner fears also cause him to say no. But he meets a mentor. He meets somebody who gives him advice. That mentor may take the form of a genuinely mentoring figure like a father or a benign uncle, but it can also be a book that he reads that gives him the impetus to accept that call. So after hesitating, he says, yes, I will go. And like Bilbo in The Hobbit, he says, I'm off on an adventure. And he leaves his hobbit hole, he leaves what is familiar, he crosses the threshold, and he goes into the world of the adventure, which we can call the special world. And this also initiates Act 2 of the story. And in Act 2, he meets a series of tests. He encounters a series of tests and trials. He meets allies who help him on his journey. He meets enemies who try to thwart him. And all the time that he's undergoing these tests and trials, his mettle as a hero is being tested. And he is developing the attitudes and the skills that he needs for the adventure. So generally speaking, the tests and trials get more and more testing as he proceeds. He then, according to Joseph Campbell, approaches the inmost cave. Now, it's not, he didn't accidentally call it the inmost cave, because a great deal of any person's adventure is internal. It's about meeting your own demons. It's about slaughtering the doubter within you. It's about finding the courage within yourself to do what has to be done. And as he approaches that final battle, well, it's not actually the final battle, but the most severe battle of all, well, in a film, he will have partial victories and partial defeats throughout this period of the story, this stage of the story. It's a kind of roller coaster ride of success and failure, 2 steps forward and 1.5 steps back. If the story is a courtroom trial story, then he will succeed in some things that he's trying and fail in other things that he's trying. Some evidence will be accepted, other evidence will be thrown out. One witness will turn up, another witness will be murdered. And then he encounters the enemy in an ordeal. So this is where the worst happens. He experiences the most difficult of hurdles and obstacles. And this will inspire in him a life crisis. This will be really a terrible, terrible, it'll be The Old Man and the Sea. I like to quote it because it's such a perfect hero's journey. It will be the fight with the marlin that will test the hero's endurance, that will keep him, that will wound him, that will wound his soul, in fact. But ultimately, he will seize the sword. He will, that's what Campbell called it, he will survive and he will seize the reward from that ordeal. Now, this is not the climax of the story. This is the crisis that is the kind of heart of the story. And that encounter with his nemesis, which includes elements of himself, will prepare him for the final conflict. But before that happens, he imagines now, having defeated the dragon, that he's home and dry. Bilbo in The Hobbit has helped kill the dragon of the Lonely Mountain. And he thinks that it's all done and dusted. And so he prepares to take the road home. But actually, during this stage of the journey, there's an intimation that worse is to come. So there's a momentary pause in the action. It's the eye of the hurricane. And then he meets his final test. He meets his final test where he will have to use everything that he's learned up till now to take on the final conflict. And that might be almost entirely an internal conflict. But he will emerge with that with a fresh understanding of himself. In fact, you could say that during this phase of the journey, that's 11th stage of the journey, he dies. The hero, as he was, dies. And a new hero is born who has new capacities, a new understanding, fresh insight into himself and the world. And he returns with that understanding, which we might call the elixir, to the world, because it will be of use and value to the community from which he came. Okay, that's how many minutes? A 10-minute introduction to the hero's journey.
Yes, I know that we've sort of zipped through this a little bit, and it's obviously got, a lot more complex than what is we've sort of generally outlined here, but that gives you a good idea of the different stages. And remember that you can always use this model no matter what you're writing, whether you're writing a comedy or whether you're writing a love story or even a domestic drama. These stages really can help you in whether you're writing a book or whether you're writing a movie, and because it really is about character development and a journey that your character will go on. And more or less these stages will be covered in nearly every narrative that you attempt. You'll see that it's broken up into acts, into Act 1 and Act 2 and Act 3. And this is the classic structure of nearly all stories. It comes from the ancient world, from Aristotle, the philosopher, who wrote a philosophical piece called Poetics, which is about the 3-act structure of plays. He was a dramatist and a poet, obviously, and a philosopher. And he developed this idea that there was a structure, and that sounds very posh and interesting, and if you know anything about philosophy, but in a simple layman's terms, it means there's a beginning and there's a middle and an end. So there's a kind of a setup, then there's a period of conflict, and then there's a resolution. So that is how all stories are kind of built. And the hero's journey fits very well into that 3-act structure. Okay, I think we can go on to some questions now, which have come in. Our questions began.
Okay, so with Carolyn Hurst.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Carolyn said, she started with a comment, but let me read it. She said, I know there are many ways to do the journey and that starting at the beginning and moving through is not generally the best. Well, my comment on that is that it's often the best way, is that the chronological story is actually the most logical way of telling a story, and it's the way that most stories are told. So you must remember also that chronology, we're not talking necessarily the strict chronology of time, but the chronology of story. Every story traces the dramatic arc of a character, the way in which a character starts off somewhere and meets various situations and changes and ends in a very different place from where they began. So there's a kind of psychological chronology of every story. Now, Carolyn says, I've heard that you might start with something dramatic and then go back to the beginning. And of course, lots of stories do that, or lots of writers do that, because it's a way of hooking your reader with an exciting episode from later in the journey, and then they will say, but 6 months before, and then they go back to the chronological start. Yes, indeed. I mean, it's a familiar trick of structuring. I mean, if you remember, and then there are all sorts of variations on that. James Bond's movies often begin with the end of the previous adventure. Okay, so a dramatic, extraordinarily active ski run down the side of a Swiss mountain with guns firing and avalanches falling and so on and so on. And you get to the bottom and a beautiful blonde meets him and he's got the villain. But that's the end of the previous story. So it's entirely a trick that the producers and the writers of the James Bond movies use in order to capture your attention. Then they go on to the rather drabber, the rather more humdrum beginning of the current adventure. And then, of course, there are all sorts of other ways of structuring story. I don't know if you've seen a fantastic, one of my favorite rom-coms. I'm not the most knowledgeable about rom-coms, I have to say, but I have watched some. And I think that the best that I've seen is 500 Days of Summer, Summer being a girl, a woman, and the 500 Days of Summer are the 500 days of their relationship. And the film proceeds by skipping between days. So it might begin with day 498, and then the next is day 1, and then the next one is day 137, and then the next one, and so on. But it does end with day 500. And it's wonderful because it challenges the viewer to make sense of the chronology. Damages is another drama series that also plays fast and loose with chronology in quite an intricate intercutting between the past and the slowly advancing present, at least the future and the slowly advancing present. But Lord of the Rings, all of Songs of Ice and Fire, what Game of Thrones, all of the books are all told chronologically. The Old Man and the Sea, The Lord of the Rings, most books are written chronologically. So if you want our advice on what is the simplest way to begin your first novel or your first screenplay, is write it chronologically. If you find in the end that the beginning is a little bit unexciting, you can always cut a chunk out of the middle and put it at the beginning. You can do lots of things after you've got the basic story down, but I would begin with the basic story in chronological order. There, Nish.
Yeah, there's a question here from, I think, is it Leela or Lila? Sorry if I've mispronounced your name. But she asks, is there any ideal process of starting to write? Do we start with characters or plotting and planning? Well, there's no really ideal way to start or typical way to start. I think everyone starts writing in a different way, and I think there aren't really rules to this particular question. But I would say that, you know, when drama was first written, it was often the plot that determined the story. So, for example, something like the Odyssey, which we mentioned earlier, the plot was maybe even more important than the hero, because people believed at that time, the ancient Greeks believed that your fate was sort of predetermined. But now we live in a time, a sort of post psychotherapy time, where we don't believe that anymore. We believe that in a way we're driven a lot by our own inner impulses. And so a result of that is that even the way that we write characters now in novels and movies has changed tremendously. So what often happens is we write the characters first, or we develop the characters first, because we go according to the premise that characters and the psychology of the character is actually what determines the plot. So in other words, the type of inner forces that are working within the character will make them make certain decisions, and that will actually determine their fate. And we'll also think of things, well, the character would behave like this, or the character would behave like that. And we start to read the story from inside the character, what the character wants, what the character needs, the tensions that are inside the character. So although, you know, a lot of popular fiction is often written, for example, fantasy and often sci-fi, there's an idea and there's a plot, and then the characters kind of morph more into the plot. But usually with literary fiction, for example, and in sort of slower films or more arty sort of films, the character is kind of determines everything. So it's a balance, and it depends on what you're interested in and what kind of thing you enjoy writing. There's also, you say, how much detail do you need for the characters that are not the protagonist? Sorry, I'm just trying to read this here. How much detail do you need for characters that are not the protagonist? And how do you know whether a character is important enough to have an in-depth character analysis? Well, I would say that only your major characters need to be examined in depth. Otherwise, you know, you will have a very long, sprawling story and it can lose focus. So usually one would concentrate on the protagonist, who's the main character, possibly the antagonist, who's the character who is in opposition to that character, and maybe one or two other characters. So say 3 or more at most, because otherwise a novel can become very unwieldy, and so can a film. So even though in films we may have different types of structures, like for example, Tarantino's films like Pulp Fiction is one that people often mention, they will say, oh, but there's all these different characters and all these different journeys. And that is true, but it's still, you know, in the end, centers around Vincent Vega, and the story is carried by 1 or 2 characters predominantly. And then Lily says, do you have templates for plotting? Well, the hero's journey is a form of template, I think, but there's also the 3-act structure that I mentioned before. And that structure fits quite neatly into the hero's journey, although there are differences and their arguments about the second act, because the second act is usually twice the length of the first and third act. But like anything, you know, these rules are there to be broken. It is just very useful to know them because they give you something to work with. You're not just working in a completely free space. Then you've asked, how do you write a memoir like a novel? And you would write it like it must conform to the rules of any good story, in the same way that a piece of fiction would. The character must embark on a journey, face tests and challenges, overcome them, and learn from them. And also to write would be quite boring. You would focus on the most dramatic parts of the person's life, and you would highlight those, and you would find a way to link them. But what you would always be doing is remembering that even in a memoir, your character is going on the hero's journey. So if you're writing about yourself, you would write about what instigated the journey, what was the inciting incident that made you decide to change your life, or whatever it was. How the resistance that you'd feel to going on the journey, the nervousness you'd have about changing your life, then the ordeals and the tests and the trials that happen as you pursue this dream or whatever it is that you want, that you as a protagonist want to do, and then what lesson did you learn from it? So this structure can be used in memoirs as much as it can be used in any other way. Then you've asked, in particularly in regards to scenes and structure and character development. I think I've sort of covered that more or less. But my recommendation to people who are writing memoirs is to really try and think of yourself as a character. What would you be interested in finding out about yourself? You wouldn't want to know all the little details, things that may be of significance to you, but are not exciting to other people. You have to be quite ruthless with yourself when you write a memoir, because, you know, there's always the inclination to be a bit indulgent. And if there is ever danger with memoirs, it's people forgetting that they're actually writing fiction. There is no such thing as true life. Everything is a fiction, because everything is our imagined life rather than a factual life.
Okay, so we've had a couple of questions that have popped up on the... I wonder, Zaki, whether your question about writing memoirs has been answered by what Michelle has just said. I hope it has been. Sue Adams asked whether the hero's journey holds for readers aged 8 to 12. And I would say absolutely it holds for that age group. In fact, you could even argue that it's even more important that you have that kind of structure for that age group. And if you examine, I'm sure, if you examine the vast majority of books for children of that age, they will follow that kind of pattern. It's a pattern, not a recipe, right? And it's sometimes difficult to discern the elements of the pattern, but I promise you they are there. Now, Adelbert, you asked an interesting question, and it happens to coincide very much with the question that Melissa Siebert has asked, and which I'm going to answer now. And that has to do with the antagonist. But let me get to that in a minute. So Melissa had 3 questions, in fact. She says, in terms of the 12 modules, Melissa, by the way, is doing our Hero's Journey course at the moment, which we should tell you about later in the webinar. But she says, in terms of the 12 modules placement within the story, how rigid is that? Do the modules shift at all in terms of their distance from each other? Presumably, she says, they never shift their order. Well, the fact is they often do shift their order. the order that I gave you in that potted description of the hero's journey can shift and often does shift. And there is an infinite number of variations. I don't know if you've ever seen a film called Shallow Grave. It's a very good, underrated film. And it starts with the boon. It starts with that second last stage of the journey. So you can really do almost anything if you're clever. So in some stories, the inciting incident, the invitation, the call to adventure happens before the beginning of the film or the novel. In others, and I'm thinking now of French Connection 2, to be very specific, the reward, the return, and the resurrection are all collapsed into a single scene. So it really is not a recipe, it's a kind of user's guide. And it's particularly useful, I think, when you're analyzing the story that you've read and you're looking for weaknesses. And if you sense a weakness, it might well be that you haven't hit one of the marks of the hero's journey. So that's where it can be particularly useful. Melissa then asked how the stages of the hero's journey correspond to certain points in a screenplay, i.e. the point of no return, the midpoint, the climax, etc. Well, those are all part of another template. I'm not sure who developed that at the beginning initially, but there is, of course, as we've already suggested, that the 3-act structure can be overlain over the hero's journey. So the call to adventure is or is part of the inciting incident. The move from the ordinary to the special world, that move through the threshold, signals the end of Act 1 and the beginning of Act 2. The ordeal is the climax of Act 2. The road home ushers in Act 3. The resurrection is the climax of the story. So there is this rough correspondence all the way through. And it's useful to think of both of those structural patterns while you're writing your story. And then the third question she asks is the one that Adalbert echoed. Melissa said, if each character in a story, or each main character, has his or her own arc, does that mean that each character goes on their own hero's journey? And the answer is yes. Okay, so normally, she says, the journey is told through the protagonist's perspective, but wouldn't it be useful to map out a hero's journey for the antagonist as well, if not for other characters? Would that work? Well, the fact is, every character in a story is on his or her own hero's journey. That is true. Just, if you like, each of us is also. So someone I read recently suggests that as an exercise, we should, just for ourselves, not necessarily to get into our story, we should tell the antagonist's hero's journey, right? This would involve thinking of the true hero as the antagonist, right? So you've got Mr. White, who's the hero, and Mr. Black, who's the antagonist. So for a moment, think of Mr. Black as the hero and Mr. White as the antagonist. This forces a very interesting thought experiment on you, and that is to remember that nobody thinks of himself as an antagonist. I mean, Donald Trump doesn't, right? He is the hero of his own story. What he does isn't a litany of lies and deceptions and conniving. It's all in terms of his goals and so on. You can think of that. I mean, it's uncomfortable, I admit, and it's uncomfortable to do that for your antagonist in a story who's not Mr. Trump. But that antagonist will justify everything that he does in terms of his goals and his values. And I think it's really useful to do that because it reminds us that everyone is complex, that the antagonist is not simply an evil villain whose only goal in life is to thwart the hero. I mean, what kind of world is that? Well, of course it can be. You can have such all stories are possible. Okay, so that's the end of my answer to a very interesting question from both of you.
Okay, now
let me just say one last thing, because Adalbert asked whether you can tell the antagonist's hero's journey in parallel with the hero's journey. And yes, you can. You definitely can. I don't think it's often done, but it's definitely possible and interesting.
Okay, I have a question here from, I think it's Cami. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing everyone's name, but I haven't actually heard you say or pronounce your name, so I'm probably doing it incorrectly. But and I don't know if it's Cami, is he or she, or anyway, it says, how do you deal with using tenses when you're writing? So this is a question that we get quite often. It's not directly related to the hero's journey, so I'll answer it very briefly. It very much depends on what kind of book you're writing and whether you're dealing with a first person or third person perspective. So tenses will be really determined by what sort, for example, if you're writing in the present tense, you'll be, which is a sort of I did this and I went there and I did that, which that seems to be quite fashionable now in contemporary fiction.
I have to break in. You were talking about the point of view there quickly. I went there is the point of view. So
yes, I was sorry, point of view. But I'm just saying in terms of tenses, if you're writing in the present tense, it can be an enormous challenge. So it will give immediacy to your writing. It will make it feel as if it's happening right now. But further along the line, there's all sorts of other problems that come into being. The main one being when you want to talk about something that's happened in the past. And then you can spend quite a lot of time trying to work out how to get your tenses right. So in the sense that it is certainly possible and it's very popular now, and I think it might also, I have no doubt, have something to do with film and script writing, which is always written in the present tense. I would be very sure that I wanted a specific kind of effect before I embarked on that. I mean, when you write in the past tense, it's always much easier. It's much, much easier to write in the past tense. Of course, if you're writing dialogue, you're always writing in the present tense. But skipping tenses can be extraordinarily difficult. I mean, and you've got to be a very skilled writer to do it. I think, I mean, for example, I'm thinking of who wrote, who's just written the Thomas Cromwell novels, Hilary Mantel. She jumps tenses a lot in her fiction and her literature. And sometimes it sort of uncomfortably moves between present tense, past tense, and you don't always know where you are. It gives it sort of a certain type of uncertainty about time, and it also creates a sort of unreliable narrator. So that's why it's also quite popular. But you've got to be very skilled to do that. And it's not within the ambit of most writers. So if I would have to say, if you're just beginning writing, or you've just started, or you don't have a very specific reason for writing in the present tense, it's always advisable to write in the past tense.
I'll just add that on our mentoring program, we walk people through the books that they're writing. And I have to say that when people choose to write in the present, they get tangled up repeatedly. It really is, it appears to be the easiest tense because we talk like that. We talk in the present tense. I'm talking in the present tense right now. So we think it's easy, but actually it gets very complicated. And when you get into subjunctives, oh my God, present tense.
And yes, I mean, we've just had someone who's been on the hero's journey, who started off with a book that was written very much in the present tense. And as soon as she switched and changed the whole manuscript to the past tense, it just released something. It just became so much easier for her to actually write, because she got so caught up and so entangled, specifically in the time issue, because writing is all about the management of time. How do you manage time? Time is the big existential question when you're writing. You know, where are you? What are the time frames? How do you manipulate time, and so on? And it's much easier to do that in the past tense.
Yeah. Okay, I have a question from Liesel. If characters are based on real people, how much do you tell them about your story? And I would say that you tell them as much as you think they can stand. And then she said, and I'm being serious. And when doing research with people, groups, or organizations, again, how much do you share? What do you tell them about your story? And I think that you less is more in this case. You tell them that you want to get your facts right. That's why you're talking to them. So you want the facts to be correct. If they say, what are you writing? You say, I'm writing a fiction, but I want to get the facts in my fiction right. And if they say, what is the fiction? Then you say, I'd love you to read it when it's out in book form in 2 years' time. Don't share too much unless you have a relationship with the person. But generally, be discreet.
Yes, I mean, if I may just add to that, I have just been battling through a book where I did just the most enormous amount of research and went to speak to hundreds of people, and then spent an incredible amount of time trying to work out if I'd got if I'd done this the right way and the wrong way, and so on. And then within a few months, you know, the laws had changed and things had shifted so much. So what is clear is that you're writing a truth, and you're writing a truth according to yourself. And you can never really be true to what they tell you. They may give you insights, but you're not going to verbatim translate what they've told you onto the page. You're going to interpret it or reinterpret it in the way that you see fit. So in the end, they don't really need to know much at all. You can just say, I'm writing a book and it's about this, very vaguely, and you just get them to talk, because you're not really going to end up using most of that material. That's the truth of the matter. It's almost just a security blanket for yourself as a writer, because writing is an act of imagination. So you might base it on what seems factual, but in the end, it's just another type of fiction. I'm just going on to a question that came from Janice, who says, and this is very interesting question, it's very relevant. I'm writing about a quiet, calm, introverted, but strong and kind heroine. How do I create a path for her that is not boring and wimpish while keeping her in character? So I love this question, because one of my favorite heroines is Jane Eyre. And Jane Eyre is all those things. She's quiet, she's calm, she's introverted, she's strong, and she's kind. And it's one of the more gripping pieces of fiction that have ever been written. And I think if you can place yourself in your quiet, calm, introverted, strong, kind heroine, so that we completely identify with her, that we love her, that we feel her pain and we feel her desires and we feel her needs and we feel her pain and we feel her fear and we feel her joy and her laughter and all those things, she will be as exciting as Hercules or Superman and as gripping. It's all in how strongly you can imagine yourself within your character. You have to inhabit your character fully and absolutely. Your character can be anybody, can be a little mouse living under the floorboard. If you can enter into the world of your character, you can bring them alive. So it won't be boring unless you've written it in a boring way, is what I would say, which is a bit of a hard truth. But a great character, no matter what kind of character they are, and often it's the quiet, introverted characters who make the most impact on us, rather than the big swashbuckling heroes. It's actually those characters who stay with us because they reflect something of ourselves and our own insecurities, because deep down inside, we are all actually quiet people. You're pretending to be something else. So I would say, go for it. I look forward to reading about this calm, quiet hero. Actually, it would be a great change from King Trump.
Okay. Tanya Matthews asks a nice question. I'm particularly interested, she wrote, in the hero's journey, as it is a feature of the literature that I teach to high school pupils. I always use the image below as the starting point. I'm going to put that image on the screen in a moment. This works well with Ulysses and other more traditional poems and classic stories. In creative writing, I struggle to modernize this concept for them, especially the ideas of supernatural aid and the gifts of the goddesses and the gods. Do you have any modern versions of the graphic or any modern stories that you suggest that I could use to illustrate this concept? So let me put up two things here. I'm going to put up side by side. On the left of your screen is the graphic that Tanya showed me. So there's the call to adventure. And then this is a version of a description of the hero's journey that is quite close to Joseph Campbell's original, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. He used phrases like supernatural aid, the threshold guardians, and so on. And all of that you can read in Hero with 1,000 Faces. But it has been simplified. And I just dashed into the internet and I found this particular, now I don't know if you can read it. Let me read, I can just read the captions. So, ordinary world, call to adventure, the bugle, refusal of the call, meeting the mentor, crossing the threshold, test allies, enemies, climbing the mountain, approach the dragon's den, the ordeal, striking down the dragon, seizing the treasure, the road back, resurrection, return with the boon, is a much more relatable series of images, it seems to me. So let me stop sharing that because I want to get back to the notes that I made for your answer. And don't get detoured. Don't allow yourself to be detoured by some of the vocabulary that Campbell used. You know, the fact is that the hero's journey is based on an analysis in the end, in the final analysis, on the journeys that we go through in real life. And on our course, on our various courses, we have traced those ordinary journeys that people go on. The journey from adolescence to young adulthood. The journey from never having had a girl or boyfriend before to having one. The journey from getting your first job is a hero's journey. And actually, there are all the same stages in that life's journey that there are in the hero's journey. But you wanted to know some possible stories that you could use. Well, The Hobbit is one such story. The Old Man and the Sea is another such story.
I think the Hunger Games, if you're teaching young people,
The Hunger Games, absolutely.
The character of Katniss Everdeen is the sort of classic heroine story. And also To Catch a Mockingbird is also a brilliant kind of hero's journey as well. So I think in contemporary fiction, there's a lot. I mean, if you're teaching youth, I'm not quite sure of the age of the young people that you're teaching, but a lot of youth fiction follows the hero's journey.
But the hero's journey will be found, remember the earlier question about 8 to 12-year-olds, it'll be found in 3 to 6-year-old stories. So there's one of my favorite children's stories is called Dogger. And it's about a little boy who has a stuffed toy called Dogger, a little stuffed dog. And he loses the dog one day when he goes to town with his sister and mother. And he is totally and utterly undone because Dogger had been would eat supper with him, would sleep with him, would be his constant companion. And now he's distraught. And the next Saturday, his mother says, well, let's go to the church fete. You must stop worrying about Dogger. And they go to the church fete. And on one of the stands, he sees Dogger for sale. And we understand what happened. He left it in town. It was found by somebody who gave it into the church fete as something that could raise money. And so he sees Dogger and he rushes off to his sister and he says, I found him. And his sister takes him to the stall and somebody has just bought him. Right? And again, it looks as though all is lost. And then his sister manages to persuade that person to sell it to her. And all is re-won. Now that story is actually a hero's journey and it takes place over 14 pages. So yeah, I mean, my sense is that almost every story you find for kids and young people will have all, if not most, of the elements of the hero's journey.
Yes, and someone here on chat mentioned The Outsiders. That's also a really good book for the hero's journey. Right. Where are we in terms of questions?
Roberts' question.
Okay, we've been through that. Francis Roberts says, I have a novel in bits and pieces that I'm trying to put together. It is based on true events. Do I need to disguise characters to respect people involved in the story? I think we've sort of gone through this, or we've touched on this a little bit, but I would say, usually people don't recognize. One of the sort of quite interesting things I've found about using people as prototypes for characters is very often they won't recognize themselves. But then often you'll write a character that's not based on anyone you know particularly, but people come up to you and say, oh, I know that character, that's me, it's based on me, isn't it? It's quite strange. So I think people will project onto characters whatever they will. I think unless you write about someone who's unmistakable, like an unmistakable public figure, and the work kind of defames them in some way, I would not really think too much about worrying about that. And no matter how you write the characters, you're never going to write what they think they are. You know, it's your perception of them. It's not how they think of themselves. So unless you give them the name or you directly lift a situation that is unmistakable, that everyone will know, oh, that was the day that Auntie Maggie, you know, threw beer over Uncle Bert's head or something, that most people are unlikely to know where you're drawing your prototype from. And another aspect of this is that as soon as you start writing that character in detail, you'll find it won't be that character anymore. In a sense, you're just using that as a jumping off point for your imagination. There's something about that person that intrigues you, but it's not the person per se that's intriguing you. It's something in that character that has seized your imagination, and that and you want an answer to it. You want to almost find out what is the mystery of this person? What makes this person tick? And in the process of writing that character, you'll find that they will morph into a completely different character. So I think all writers draw from real life to a certain extent. So I really wouldn't worry about that at all. In fact, I think it's a plus if you are inspired by people that you know. It means you're curious and interested in them.
Pat Conroy, the American writer who died in the last few years, used as models members of his family, models for characters in his novels. And he completely alienated his family. They hated him with a deep hatred. In fact, they blamed him for the suicide of his brother, whom they said committed suicide because of a portrayal that he'd made of his brother in one of his novels. It was terrible. So don't go down that road.
No, I don't think it needs to be that extreme.
There's a quick from, yeah, sorry, Michelle.
No, it is interesting because also when people write memoirs, I think they come up against the same problem, essentially. I mean, I recently read a novel by the writer Paul Theroux, who writes nonfiction and he writes fiction, and he wrote a story about his family, and basically it's a kind of memoir of his life, and it was a kind of a no holds barred, burn them up kind of story. He really went for the people. He was extremely critical of them in a very, and actually quite a disturbing kind of way, because sometimes those kind of books can also be about revenge, what they call the revenge memoir. But I think when you're writing fiction, generally, of course, writing about your family is always very difficult, and not to be highly recommended unless you feel you have to get it off your chest. But I think that if you're writing fiction, it's very seldom that people recognize themselves.
Very seldom, except when they recognize themselves in characters that have nothing to do with them.
Yes, and that's what I find often happens. Yeah. People say that to me. Yeah, that's me, they'll say.
We're gonna end the, I mean, there are two more questions that we haven't got to, but it's 5 o'clock. Can we spend 5 minutes trying to answer these two? The first one is very simple. It's from Lunga in Port Elizabeth. And Lunga says that he has trouble finding the time to write. He lives in a small flat with members of his family. In lockdown, it's difficult to, I mean, we really do sympathize, Lunga. yeah, you know, I instantly thought, well, I used to spend a lot of time in coffee shops. I found them very congenial, but of course that's not altogether available anymore, except maybe it will be with vaccine. You can get up early in the morning. As Mish and I were talking about your question before we came, before the webinar began, and I said, what is this? How does this relate to the hero's journey? And we thought, well, actually it does, because you have to use the dark night of the soul when everyone else is asleep to do your writing. But beyond that, we don't really have much advice, but lots of sympathy. And then finally, Mish, you have Elise's questions.
Yes. I just want to give one bit of advice to Lunga, speaking as someone who often had to write when I had two small children who used to wake up all through the night. I just try and grab an hour. Lunga, if you even grab 30 minutes a day to just sit and write somewhere, get away, or also another thing that I found quite useful having small children is I learned to sort of lock them out. I learned to sort of almost, it was almost the chaos kind of went on around me, and I sort of, sometimes when you get used to writing and you write a lot, you can just actually cut out the whole world. And you don't even, I mean, a bomb could fall on you and you would be so engrossed you wouldn't notice. So it's good to just get in the habit, even if you write for 30 minutes a day and you just sit there and you write and you don't allow the noise and the chaos around you. You describe your mother's soapies and stuff. And I know it's very distracting, but you can actually literally write anywhere. You can train yourself to write in the biggest chaos. And Richard and I know that because we've had to write on movie sets, and that's quickly write a scene on a movie set. Okay, now I've got a question from Elise, and she says, how do you consistently share your character's personality while still providing room for character growth? Now, I'm not entirely sure that I understand this question, Elise. I think I'm not sure, but I think often people tend, or writers tend to confuse personality with character, and it's not really the same thing. So for example, the personality is almost what I would call the false face of the character, the changing persona that they present depending on who they are interacting with in the book or the movie. So your hero or your hero character need not be consistent at all. In fact, the best characters are quite contradictory and do quite surprising things. Because you say that the hero, does the hero need to have a relatively persistent personality reflected in their actions and speech? And how do you achieve that without feeling like you're overdoing it by using the same phrases or the same descriptions of what they do physically? And I would shy away from using phrases or repetitive phrases or physical movements to convey character, because in a sense that means you're observing them from the outside, and what you want to do when you're writing fiction particularly is you want to inhabit the inside of the character. And so you're not, you know, for example, if the character may notice that, your protagonist may notice that there's a person sitting next to him who's got a very uncomfortable twitch, but if you keep repeating that throughout your book, that the protagonist always notices this one person as a twitch, it's going to become extremely annoying. And the protagonist himself is not aware if they have a twitch. So I don't know if I'm making myself entirely clear, but I'm saying try and steer away from explaining your character by the phrases they use and by their physical movements, because in a way that's really about the outer personality of the character, not the inner journey of the character. And the point of view is everything. You must write from the inside out, not from the outside in. If you're writing for the screen, obviously you do write from the outside, which is we would observe the characters and see what they're doing and try and read their situation from looking at the visual representation of them. But even then, when you're a screenwriter, you try and shy away from those things unless it's got some dramatic purpose, because also it's something that the actor would be averse to taking on usually, and actors also use their own body language and their own tics, and you try not to be too specific. So I don't know if that answers that question, but I hope it does. And I think we're at the end of our questions, unless there's anything particular that has come up on the chat.
I just want to interject. I worked as the editor of a section of a newspaper years and years ago, and my sports editor used a particular word in every single sentence he uttered, and that word was whatchamacallit. And I often thought, if you put that into a character's mouth, you would drive your reader crazy. It would drive them crazy, like trying to mimic a stammer on the page. It does not work. You do it once, you establish what he does, but then you don't repeat it over and over again. Anyway, that was my contribution to that last question. Okay, I mean, I've looked at the questions or your remarks. You've made a lot of remarks, and I think that's great. Some of the questions related to something that had been said. And so, for instance, Karen Daniels says, how do you do this when you're writing a memoir and you are the heroine? But I don't know what how do you do this refers to.
Hi, Richard.
Yes, hello, Karen.
No, I was just referring to what Michelle said earlier about allowing the reader to enter into the world of the heroine, like with Jane Eyre, like making the reader part of that person, even though they're a quiet, shy type of person, their joys, their, you know, what Michelle said. So I was just wondering about that.
Okay. I mean, a memoir is kind of tailor-made for you to explore yourself in the way that we would urge writers of fiction to enter into the person, into the character of their protagonist. The more personal a memoir, the more riveting themes and so on is essential if you're writing a memoir.
Another aspect of the memoir, if I might just jump in here briefly, is honesty and self-reflection. So it's important not to write a memoir as a sort of aggrandizement of yourself, where you are the hero with no flaws or the heroine with no flaws, because people will identify with people's weaknesses and flaws and struggles. They don't really identify with their triumphs so much. Maybe if they've struggled to achieve it, they'll celebrate with them, but we're much more interested in human beings and how human beings like ourselves respond to these challenges and the struggles that they go through. So the more vulnerable and the more open and the more honest and the more reflective the character in the memoir, the stronger the work will be.
Okay, I think that about wraps it up. We are 11 minutes over time. Thank you for sticking with us. Don't forget that All About Writing runs a quite fabulous course on the hero's journey. Melissa has, I see, endorsed that in the chat room. And the next time that course comes up, which is, I think, in January, seriously consider joining us for the journey of your life.
Yeah, it's been very exciting. We've just completed the first one with a great group of people. And it's been a big learning curve for Richard and myself as well, which it always is when you work with writers. I mean, we learn more from you guys than you ever learn from us. So
that is
we hope to see you all again soon.
Okay, guys. Bye for
Okay,
now.
lovely to meet you all. Bye.